Attention humans, do you remember that day when our homie Starman was sent into space on his dope roadster? I certainly do. Starman had an encounter with Mars last year, and I was a little disappointed that it was only a flyby of Mars. We all know Starman deserves better, which is why I will launch his twin brother to land on Mars, and I will use Starship to do it. Instead of launching from the land of hurricanes known as Florida, I will do this launch at the Kerbal Space Center. This video is pretty hype, so I highly suggest all of you stick around until the end, because we have some pretty cursed rockets lined up. So anyway, let's jump right in. I have some bad news. The super heavy booster that was supposed to carry this Starship into orbit was sick today, and I didn't have another booster waiting around. In the end, I decided to use 2 Falcon Heavy boosters to get this Starship into orbit. Luckily the boosters were strong enough to carry the Starship. This mission is very important, since the payload is Starman's brother. Failure is not an option. As we reach supersonic speeds, I check up on Starman's twin and see how he's doing. Out of the corner of my eye, I can tell that the boosters are beginning to get tired from carrying this Starship. However, they continue to press forward, or technically they are pressing upwards. Then I throttle up the Raptor engines in order to maintain balance. Once we reach the upper parts of the atmosphere, I begin my gravity turn. As my gravity turn began, I noticed that our G-force was starting to get close to 3, which is not okie dokie for Starman's twin. I decided to shut off the engines now and tell the exhausted boosters to head home. In response, both boosters break away from Starship and begin their boost backburn. Both boosters seemed to have a pussy attitude, but that changed after I threatened to send them into the sun. Just before we touch the atmosphere, both boosters deploy their grid fins and prepare for re-entry. This re-entry wasn't too hard because me and the atmosphere were on good terms today. As we approach the landing site, I begin to switch to grid fin control as the air gets thicker and thicker. Once I reach the landing site, I ignite the engines and stabilize the boosters. This landing will only use one engine due to some extra margins. I deploy the landing legs at 500 meters and both boosters touch down softly. A very clean landing indeed. Meanwhile, our Starship is creeping its way to orbit. I don't have as much fuel on board, since I had to use some of it to help the boosters. This orbital insertion didn't take long, so I took the time to check up on Starman's brother. He told me he was pretty excited to beat his brother at something. That was definitely not the inspiring answer I was looking for. Anyway, 3 minutes later, and Starman finally reached orbit. Meanwhile, at the Kerbal Space Center, our refueling Starship is waiting at the pad. I decided to add 2 Falcon Heavy boosters to Super Heavy, because this Starship will need to hold extra juice to refuel Starman in orbit. I know guys, that this rocket is the most cursed thing your eyes have ever seen, but trust me, this rocket has some serious capability. My gravity turn was pretty smooth, and as we reached space, I shut down the engines. I told the side boosters that it was time to go home. Both boosters turned around and began their journey to the Kerbal Space Center. The boost backburn didn't take long and both boosters successfully deploy their grid fins for re-entry. Our entry burn went pretty smoothly, and as we approached the landing zone, I extended the landing legs and prepare for touchdown. This is probably the smoothest landing I have ever done. Meanwhile, the Super Heavy booster has used almost all its fuel, so I separate it from the tanker Starship. Starship then goes on its way to orbit as the Super Heavy booster reorients for re-entry. The grid fins deploy as we slam into the atmosphere. This re-entry was very intense, and we were landing this booster 800 kilometers downrange on a drone ship. In order to slow down enough to land, I will use all the Raptor engines. As we close the distance to the drone ship, I throttle up the engines and make small adjustments. This landing has little room for error, since this drone ship isn't built to support the weight of a Super Heavy booster. Eventually I touch down at a slow speed and the drone ship seems to be holding up just fine. What a landing. Meanwhile, our tanker Starship has already reached Starman's brother in orbit.
Okay, let's see here. We are approaching the Starship in orbit with our tanker Starship. We're going to dock and refuel the craft. As we approach, I noticed that the
Mech Jeb, why are you interrupting my commentary?
Okay, Mort, shut the frick up.
Why are you whispering?
I am doing your commentary for you. You need some sleep. So shush.
Nah bro, I'm taking over. Sorry guys for that rude interruption. Mech Jeb gets rowdy sometimes. Anyway, after undocking the tanker Starship, I do my deorbit burn and re-enter the atmosphere. During our re-entry we are going to be treated with some nice engine bay shots. Wow, those Raptors look like they are gonna get a pretty nice tan. Once my speed is lower than 3 times the speed of sound, I pitch the Starship forward so we can glide to the Kerbal Space Center. Once I reach the KSC, I perform the belly flop maneuver, and boy was that performance lovely. As always, we touch down softly on the pad. Back to Starman's brother. As soon as I finished landing the tanker, I immediately started my escape burn to Mars. This escape burn won't take long, but it won't be a short one. As we continue our burn, I notice that the engines are looking a little tired. I decided to give them all cookies, which keeps their performance at their best. 2 minutes later, I finally finished my escape burn. Now we can be treated to a nice view of Kerbin as we drift into interplanetary space. 3 months later, I finally reach Duna. I can see the look on Starman's face as the red planet comes into view. Once I reach my periapsis, I reorient Starship and light the engines for a capture burn. This burn will ensure that we stay in orbit around Mars. You guys probably knew that already. To all those who didn't know that, ha ha ha, get wrecked, I tricked you into learning something new. Anyway, after our capture burn, I deorbit the Starship and prepare for re-entry. This is the most intense part of the mission. Failure isn't an option. Before we get into the good stuff, I have a message from our homie Safety Doggo. Safety Doggo says to like and subscribe so he can keep you safe tonight. Anyway, back to the video. As we descend further towards the Martian surface, I begin to pitch the Starship forward. At this point we are still traveling faster than the speed of sound, and we still have to do the belly flop maneuver. When I reached 4 kilometers above the surface, I began the belly flop maneuver. I ignited all the engines at full throttle. I shut down one engine and decided to land on 2 engines instead of 1. As our speed is slowly reduced, I prepare the landing legs for touchdown. What a landing! This is a massive achievement. Starman's brother has landed on Mars and we achieved what no other KSP player has before. After my sweet landing, I opened the cargo bay door and prepared the crane. Yeah, that's right. We are gonna use the crane to lower Starman on the surface. Once the crane was fully deployed, I began to slowly lower Starman's brother. I had to take my time, since the vacuum of space doesn't do good things to the suspension of a car. As soon as the Roadster is safely on the surface, I detach the lifting frame and hoist it back up. I plan to reuse as much of this as I can. After the lifting frame is fully retracted, I begin to fold the crane and refuel the Starship. After refueling was complete, I begin my journey to orbit. This ascent was pretty easy, since the gravity on Mars is so weak and the atmosphere is so thin. I did my gravity turn a little late, but I have plenty of juice so it's fine. Once I reached 700 meters per second, I shut down the engines and began to coast to my apoapsis. Then I began my circularization burn. Finally we are back in orbit around Mars. Despite the exhaustion of the engines, we still have an escape burn to do, so I relight the engines. 3 Kerbal months later, after my escape burn finished, I finally reach Kerbin. Once I reach my periapsis, I relight the engines in order to deorbit the craft. After my deorbit burn, I prepare for re-entry. This re-entry would be pretty intense, since we are doing this from interplanetary speeds. As I approach the landing zone, I begin to make adjustments in speed. I began to lose some control over the craft because one of the flaps wouldn't move. Luckily I managed to stabilize the craft and prepare for the belly flop maneuver. This is the third one of the video. When I reached 1 kilometer above the surface, I tucked the back flaps inward and lit the engines. I began to slow my speed as the ground got closer and closer to Starship. I throttle up the Raptors as our speed is lowered. Then, I touch down softly. What a landing. Thank you all for watching. Don't forget to brush your teeth, wash your hands, and subscribe. Morks out.